Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful breakout session. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank our conference planning team. A day like today cannot happen without the hard work and effort of so many people. So if you could just stand when I say your name. Anna, Annie, Jenny, Kent, Kim, Larry, Magdalena, Lupin, Margot, Noreen, Pat, and Tamara. Thank you so much. Okay, I would also like to extend a sincere thanks on behalf of all of us to 3 individuals who made today as seamless as possible. Sara Lima Branco, Belinda Jampo, and Justin Otteson. Can you please come up to the podium? Oh, and Penny Fraser as well. These staffers have been instrumental in the logistics for today's event, including producing our conference program, making all of our wonderful name badges, and responding to all of the many, many questions from all of us. So thank you, Sara, Belinda, Justin, and Penny. And sorry, a huge, huge thank you to Pat Atherton, who, without her, this day could not be possible. So thanks, Pat. Sorry, a little bit of confusion. And, oh yeah, I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Thanks, Brittany. Great. So our panel is actually up already on stage, so thank you. Please join me in welcoming our panel today, Lillian Hung, Jim Mann, Holly Longstaff, and Jennifer Johannesen. And Stirling Bryan has kindly offered to moderate today's discussion on the ethical considerations in patient-oriented research. The panel will use Twitter, our conference app, and paper to collect questions from the floor, just like this morning. Paper questions can be given to Heather Bartlett or Annie Moore. Heather and Annie, are you in the room? Perfect, so there they are. So please just flag them if you have any paper questions. And we'll get to them after. A quick note, we know we won't get to all the questions in this short period today. We've got wine to get to at 4:45. So we are extending this discussion to a tweet chat that will be held on November 26th. That's next Tuesday from noon to 1 p.m. Please put that in your calendars. You can join the unit scientific director, Stirling Bryan, in exploring issues related to this topic and to discuss any questions from the conference panel session. And all are welcome to participate. Please follow at BC Support Unit and hashtag PPF19 for more details. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Lillian Hung is a clinical assistant professor at the UBC School of Nursing. Her research mainly focuses on examining how technology and the environment impact care experiences of persons with dementia. She works collaboratively with interprofessional practitioners to find practical solutions to address pressing problems in care settings. Jim Mann was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2007 and has since become an advocate and a speaker in an effort to reduce stigma and shatter stereotypes around Alzheimer's and other dementias. He is an active community volunteer and advisor or co-investigator with various research projects. In line with Jim's focus on ethics, Jim is an advisory council member of Research Ethics BC and was honored to be invited by the W. Morris Young School of Applied Ethics at UBC to be a visiting community scholar in July of this year. And Holly Longstaff is the Director of Privacy and Access with the Provincial Health Services Authority Research and New Initiatives. She's responsible for guiding the development, recommendation, and implementation of innovative approaches to privacy policy and practice to build accountable information stewardship and privacy-conscious practices that enable the execution of PHSA's expanded mandate and the conduct of health research. And of course, we've met Jennifer Johannesen earlier this afternoon. So with that, I will let the panel take over.
Great, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be chairing the final plenary, so thank you for that opportunity. What I'd like to do, this is a plenary that's on ethics in patient-oriented research. And so a definition of ethics that Google gave me just 10 minutes ago is moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So what I'd like you just to do in silence, in your own head, for no more than 30 minutes, no, sorry, just for a couple of seconds, is just to, first thoughts that come to your mind about applying an ethical consideration or lens in patient-oriented research. So just spend the next 10 seconds thinking, what's the first thing that comes into your head when you're thinking ethical considerations in patient-oriented research? And you can share it on Twitter, by the way, as well. I can see that Minnie is doing that already, so thank you for doing that. Good. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some questions. So now you've got something to hand in as a question, because we will want to get some questions. What we're going to do is each of our panelists is going to just give us a sense of their role in relation to ethics, and something that's, in a sense, unique to their perspective in relation to ethics in patient-oriented research. So we're going to go along the line. We're going to start at the end with Holly Longstaff, who has been introduced already, and I'm very grateful that all of the people have been introduced, because I was nervously thinking that I might have to do that, but I don't, so that's great. So Holly, if you could just share your thoughts and perspectives briefly on that come from your role on this topic.
Sure. So,
I think just speak and it should...
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my training, my PhD area and my postdoc area and my professional experiences as an ethicist, and my PhD is from the Center for Applied Ethics. I guess where ethics comes into my work now that I work in research privacy is that I see how disconnected our systems are, whether they be our privacy system, and not so much, but also our RAB system, are from patients and the patients that they're supposed to serve. They should be run based on data and evidence and the preferences of patients, and in collaboration with our clients. They are not, and it's really unfortunate that that happens, because we expect when researchers submit to us that their research is based on great data and hypotheses and questions and stuff like that, yet we don't interrogate our own work. So in my work doing research privacy at the Provincial Health Services Authority, I try to depend very heavily on public engagement literature, also the views of the various patient stakeholder groups that we have around PHSA, and also the researchers who are my direct clients.
Great. So what I'll do is just ask maybe a couple of quick questions as follow-up for each panelist, because I think each panelist is coming and providing quite a different perspective. So just a random question that you actually articulated for me earlier. Thank you, Holly. How do you think we could change the research privacy system to be more patient-oriented?
Well, I think that the current privacy system, I don't know how many folks are familiar with it in British Columbia, but research privacy, not just in British Columbia, but across Canada, is viewed as one of the #1 barriers to research with human participants in Canada. Absolutely, that is an established thing. It's been published on. In fact, my role at PHSA was created because the researchers did a research project about how terrible privacy and other systems were, made recommendations to my boss, and they created the role that the first role I filled at PHSA to try to address some of these problems.
That's great. So the world is going to be a different place because of you.
No, I think that the reason that they wanted me to do it, and the reason that I think the way I think it needs to change, is I think it needs to get plugged in with what the preferences of the public and patients actually are. So my training is in empirical research ethics, so it's based on data and doing public engagement research and stuff like that. So I think that's how we can help move our system in a different direction. But the way it's working right now is completely broken, and I don't feel like there's ways that we can even shine it up around the edges. I think it is broken, irrevocably broken, and we need to completely rethink it, and it needs to be based on principles that the folks that use patient-oriented research and public engagement research, I think it needs to be based on those kinds of principles, bioethics principles, and others.
Great, wow. So we've got a system that's completely broken and needs to be rebuilt, and you're the person who's going to do that. Thank you. So if you've got questions or comments specifically for Holly, then please enter those, and we'll get back to that. So we're next going to go to Jennifer. So Jennifer, maybe you've spoken obviously already to us, and we've got some sense of your perspective, but maybe you could give us your sort of thoughts on the unique perspective of ethics in relation to patient-oriented research.
Yeah, I'm realizing as I sit up here, I'm feeling slightly awkward about being on this panel just because my background in ethics is not related specifically to the research realm, but I'll just share a brief story to position myself. As a caregiver to my son, and when my son needed a ton of medical intervention, and there was a point when I realized I didn't really know as a parent how to be making certain decisions. I didn't know on what basis and even as his parent, I knew I was making decisions for him that as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, that he had no say in. So I consulted a bioethicist to help me puzzle through some of the topics or some of the themes that I was trying to understand better, particularly being not a religious person myself and not having this kind of touch point in my life to puzzle through some of these bigger questions. And so that was my first contact with bioethics, and I realized at that point that there is so little available to patients and caregivers in terms of this kind of bioethics consulting. So anyway, as I sort of moved through our experiences and Owen passed away and I was reflecting on our lives, I thought this is a really interesting academic area to kind of elevate out of my own personal narrative and see if there are ways to better understand my experience, but through some of these principles and themes. And so I pursued a master's in bioethics with and it was actually partway through the program I decided to do a policy focus. So I'm about as far away from research ethics. But I will say that a lot of what I comment on and speculate on or muse on is informed by my bioethics training and a lot of the bioethics principles that come into it. And it's less about, the kind of 4 pillars of, I don't even know if I could rhyme them all off now, but beneficence, maleficence, and, all those things. But more about maybe social sciences questions of who's being harmed, who benefits, who's not at the table, who are we hearing from too much, what are fairness, justice, questions like that. So that's the lens I bring to a lot of the questions I percolate in my mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. So one question that I don't want you to think that this was me asking Jennifer a difficult question, because Jennifer actually gave me this question to ask her. So, how does ethics come into focus while thinking about patient engagement in health research?
I guess I preempted myself where I answered the question already to some degree, but I would say that it's around these broader systemic questions. So it's less about, for me, when I think about the ethics of engagement in research, it's less about the interpersonal ethics. How do we treat somebody ethically? I mean, these are important questions, but that's less the realm I kind of hover in. I'm thinking more about, again, these questions of fairness and representation and who's been invited in, whose voice has been silenced because of that, who's missing from the table, what space am I occupying versus somebody else's. So those are the realms that I think about in ethics.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So Jim, I listened to the podcast that Jim did recently. In fact, we did it for our journal club, and I now know that Jim is actually called the Great Jim Mann, so we should use that title for Jim. Jim's done such fabulous work, so maybe Jim, you could share your perspective on ethics in patient-oriented research for us.
The stereotype of a person with dementia and the stigma of dementia influences many researchers who see people with dementia as automatically being unable to contribute because of their cognitive impairment. My mother had dementia, and I have, and so these personal experiences have shaped my perspective. For example, a member of an advisory board where before a meeting, some researchers on the board were in touch with organizers about my attendance. They asked how they should approach me. They had no idea what to do because I was there and I never realized how scary I was. In fact, I was told that one of the members, a researcher, until that person met me, never knew that a person with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's could communicate or live well. Consequently, I understand and have had experience with research ethics boards who are similarly influenced by the stereotype and stigma and are reluctant or unwilling to approve research studies involving the participation of people living with dementia. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great.
For now.
Thanks very much, Jim. Jim's response when asked if there were any questions that I could ask him basically said, "Isn't that your job?" So thanks, Jim. And maybe tell us a little bit about your experience when you were a patient in residence in the Research Ethics Center at UBC, because I think this is quite a different experience and an opportunity that has arisen. So if you feel comfortable, maybe you'd be willing and able to share some thoughts on whether that experience is something that was a positive one for you.
The invitation itself was amazing, and the week was very interesting because I spent the week at UBC. I met researchers, I met ethicists, and I think they were all professors there. And actually, it was quite interesting. The first day in the morning, I met the director, and I can't remember his name, who he and I had a really good discussion about research and ethics boards. And I said to Gloria Praveen later that she observed, she said that I was challenging him and that he was challenging me, and that's how the week went. And it was, but I had one-on-one meetings, but on the Thursday, we had what we called a stakeholder lunch, where all these people that I had met individually were gathered in one room along with a few other folks. And I was called a catalyst at that point because I was told that as much as these professors, these people were all at UBC, they probably had never met each other, had never talked to each other about some of these issues. So the lunch discussion was enlightening, was fascinating, and but the one thing I will just bring out was that I talked about the idea of implicit bias, and so many of the people that I met with there had never heard of it, and I had course, read about it in the Globe and Mail, really about more to do with business and HR and hiring practices. But in fact, I see that as an issue with research ethics boards.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jim. And Lillian, I've got a soft spot for Lillian because when I tweeted that I'd bought a new tie for the Congress today, she replied and said that she'd actually got new boots. So please take a look at Lillian's new boots at some point. So thank you for sporting the new boots at the conference. So Lillian, so for you as well, I mean, maybe you could just give us your perspective. I mean, you've obviously got a lot of experience working with older people with dementia and doing great work in that space. Tell us a bit about your perspective in terms of ethics in patient-oriented research.
Yeah, my role, I'm a researcher, so I've been working on 6 projects with patients, partners, and I have an ongoing team that we do research move from projects to projects. In fact, I have our research partners here. I think Lily is here, and Annette is here. We do projects together, and Jim's here. Like, I think we have done like 6 or 7 projects together. So my perspective, I think the research that we've been doing really challenged, people often think older people with dementia, cognitive impairment, or with mental health disorders, they are deemed highly vulnerable or less competent. And people often think there's a need to protect them. I challenge that perceptions about overprotections or the required competency that these people need to do research together. I mean, as a team that with these patient and family partners that we have like completed research project, we publish together, and patient partners, when we do the research, we go through a process that we do. We start with looking at the literature together. We publish like review protocol, literature review protocol, and then we publish the actual review, and we use the literature to inform how we design the research. We co-design the research. Patient and family partners help us to go out to collect data together. We bring the data back to do team analysis. We co-write the paper, and we publish the paper together, and we often have like patient and family partner to go out to conferences to co-present so that's the full life cycle of research that we do together. So I think it's really important that, to be able to do this kind of work to challenge people thinking about, how older people might need particular competency to do research with researchers.
Great. It's a fabulous story and a success story. You did give me some questions to ask you. Thank you. So what might be considered your biggest challenges, or some of the biggest challenges associated with conducting ethical patient-oriented research?
The challenges. I think the power relations, I think we hear a little bit this morning, and also throughout the day as well. I think you can think about, working with academics, researchers working with older adults or ageism, and also with mental health disorder or dementia. There's multiple layers, so you can see the unequal power. And and also we heard about this morning how institutions and funding agency could also put out barriers about having patients and family partners to be having some sort of control or in research. So I think the biggest challenge is to really push that way of thinking and to shift the power. When we do research, we don't invite one patient partner in front of like 6 or 10 researchers to do research together. We have equal number of patient and family partners and clinicians and researchers. So that's a way, the number we heard about that this morning. And, but there's many ways when we do things in terms of everyday ethics, to how we relate to each other during the process. I think there's a lot of subtle things that how we develop trust relationship and how we relate to others, yeah.
Great. So I'm sure that you've got questions. I don't know if they're flowing in at this point. So I'll just maybe pick up on this implicit bias question and maybe just ask for others to reflect. I mean, Jim's raised this as an issue, and it's interesting. I mean, it's language that I know, but not from this context, and so it's interesting that it's brought to this this context. So maybe we could just briefly get some reflections on the implicit bias issue in this context.
Sure, I can say something about that. When you mentioned earlier that, as a joke, that I was going to come and fix things for PHSA, I think the truth is the exact opposite, is that no one person has the full story, and that's the approach that we're taking at Research Privacy at PHSA. I know my little bit, the partners know their bit, the scientists know their bit, security people know their bit, and by working together as a group, in a multidisciplinary group, the quality of the reviews, the quality of the work that we do is so much higher. So I think that's the kind of approach that we take in order to try to correct our own biases, because it's impossible to do it if you're not challenged and don't have your ideas interrogated by other people. I just don't know how else to do it. So,
Others, if you have thoughts on the implicit bias?
I'm thinking about implicit bias in another way, and I think I reflect on some of the things that Jennifer talked about, like research integrity, or how scientific rigors, and how we often think about we have to follow a traditional research methodology to do things in order to produce good research. And I think that's something that I think we should be careful about that. I actually thinking about if we just, uncritically following or adhering to the traditional research approach, we can actually compromise the validity of knowledge creations when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fair point, and I think evolution is important. It's reflexivity is important. Where I feel like there's a missing piece, and it ties into implicit bias and perhaps some of the challenge you're raising here, and it's that there's a lack in my mind, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but an accounting of that reflection and that process and that evolution. So, in these other types of research that I've mentioned, like in other types of qualitative research, researcher bias, researcher reflexivity, that's included as part of the methodology and the accounting of what is elicited and captured and analyzed. So in these cases of partnering with patients, and implicit bias and whatever we think of the research ethics that's applied to that, all of these things, I think that I believe there needs to be some kind of process of reflexivity, and even if it's or an audit or some kind of way of not measuring, but capturing the encounters that lead to change or evolution. So your point is well taken for sure, and I would say that having a way to pin that down would be a real value add, I think, to what we're talking about.
Excuse me, which is in fact one of the discussions that we had during my week at UBC about the need for, like a feedback loop to ethics boards and to researchers. Because how else do you correct a mistake or, implicit bias or how, I was advised a research project that's coming to an end, and I remember the first face-to-face meeting that we had, and we had a group dinner, and the person across from me was leading one of the streams, and this was going to be in long-term care, and she made the mistake of saying to me that she would be talking to the caregivers. And I got quite animated during that discussion. And so she did end up going to talk to people with dementia. But if a young researcher starts out thinking that, I'm going to have to talk to the caregiver, and there is no feedback loop, how do they learn?
Yeah, great points, thanks. Okay, I'm going to change the tack a little bit here, and don't forget, if you're on Twitter, use hashtag PPF19. Thoughts on ethics by encouraging social media is the question, and that was hashtag PPF19, by the way. So thoughts on the ethics, on ethical implications, I guess, of encouraging discussion through social media. Anything that's particular that we should worry about? Are we, like the tweet chats, like should we be doing that?
Look, I think there's always stuff to worry about, but anything that can lead us to more inclusivity, a broader range of voices, more diversity, access for people who, you know, we get accused at the PHSA all the time, like I'll just take BC Cancer, for example. You know, are you the Vancouver BC Cancer Centre, or are you the BC Cancer, right? I mean, like, we have to serve the entire province. We have to be able to embrace technology and innovation without fear, and mistakes are gonna happen, breaches are gonna happen, bad stuff is gonna happen, but that shouldn't stop us from innovating and having a learning system so that we can correct these things as we go on. But we should never be scared of new technologies and stuff like that.
Lovely. Okay, Lillian endorses that, okay.
I totally agree with Holly, and it also makes you think about, like, who has the right to speak and who has the right to say what is legitimate, and is it just the academic, as researchers in the university, have the right to say what is right and what is legitimate knowledge, right? I see researchers actually as a collective actions, and when you have more people involved, then it brings you to think about things that you might not think about. Like Jim and I talked about a lot of times that I learn things from him. Sometimes I don't know what I don't know. Right? And you just have to, you know, but when you're with people coming from different areas or different disciplines or different, you know, organizations, then you start, like, maybe that's something I should think about, yeah.
I'll just add a brief thought here, and it's that in my regular life, when I'm not doing patient-y things, I am actually a web developer and a web strategist of sorts. And one of the things I tell my clients is that you need to meet people where they are. So where are the people you're trying to communicate with, and in a platform appropriate way, engage with them. And sometimes it's the same message across all platforms. Sometimes it's a targeted message on different platforms. But it's also easy for people who are very engaged online. It sometimes feels like everybody's online, and it's not actually true. So there are people that may be in this room that just would never tweet and would never self-identify online in the way that one is required to, because you own your persona, you own your name, you're putting your hand up in a way that identifies you. So some people lurk a lot. They might have an account that's not identified with them, and all of these things. So when you're looking to get feedback or engage people and it's all on social media, you're potentially missing an entire swath of people. So just knowing who your population is, who you're trying to reach, and this sort of shotgun approach, or machine gun approach of social media, you're only hitting the people that are there. So it's, be measured about it, and tactical and strategic and all of those things.
But I went on social media because I advocate to educate, and I am fairly active, and I like to think that there are some researchers that may pick a nugget of new information that will be new to them, and so I use it as an education tool.
Great, thanks. And I know that I nag people to get tweeting, but I also understand that it's not always a positive. So this is, I think, related to the implicit bias piece, but maybe in a different direction. So this is to do with the potential for harm and for negative impacts of patient partnering in patient-oriented research. So what does the panel think in terms of the ethical considerations when patients or caregivers might worry that their care will be affected negatively if they give feedback or comment? So that's sort of like the worry that I think is quite right, that some people experience or genuinely experience. I mean, is this something that we should be guarding against, and how might we do that? Start with Lillian, actually, if that's okay.
and
No,
using
no,
panel.
this isn't social media related particularly. We can start at the other end if you want to.
Yeah.
If you feel, yeah.
Sure, I'm okay, yeah, and I guess, again, I want to go back to the current system that we're working within. This bias issue comes up again. We have an idea of what harms to patients in the public and others mean, and, you know, we work within a very confined kind of system and a very kind of archaic system. And if we don't actually engage with those people, we don't know what those harms actually are. So I can imagine what it might be to be a participant in a particular study. But then when you actually talk to people, as you were mentioning earlier, it might be very, very different. I'm very concerned. Well, I'm not even concerned. I know that with privacy, we are anticipating harms and working with the idea that certain things are harming people. And there's all sorts of public engagement literature that shows that that's actually not harm. Like, for example, sharing data and tissue widely and linking unconsented data and tissue is something the public supports when it's being used for the public good and governed properly. And yet, any privacy person, not any, most that you speak to, is doing everything in their power to try to protect the participants from having their data, transferred. And it's not unusual for privacy people to override informed consent of patients because they're trying to prevent harm. So I think it is is a very real concern that we should all be thinking about, but it should be based on evidence and what people are actually concerned about, not what our imagination conjures up.
You've got strong views on this. That's great. I'm pleased to hear that. Please go ahead, Jennifer. Or Lillian.
Just feeding off what Holly said, that for a research, for something I was involved in, a researcher, when I talked to her, said, we've been waiting 7 months for ethics approval, and it was being held up because the group was wanting to publish the names of the people with dementia that had been involved, and ethics said, no, that can't happen. And so, whereas I'm on the other side saying, yes, I want my name there, and I want the fact that I have Alzheimer's to be there. And so, I don't quite understand how the ethics board personnel can make the decision that on my behalf when I've already insisted that the opposite be.
And I could add to that in my research that of course we have to work. I do a lot of video ethnography, so I take videos in the clinical setting to see how people in their everyday practice use technology. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential harm when we I got to be very careful about how I share those videos, and people could, have ways to misuse those videos. And ethics board often will be very nervous about, they will try to protect the patients or the person in care. And it's very tricky because if you see the video, you will see the person's face, and try to protect their identity would be very tricky. And I also agree with Jim that people should be given the options to be identified so that their contribution to research can be credited and acknowledged. Or there also the option of if they do not want to be identified, then pseudonyms could be used, and there are ways to manage the video data so to protect the persons. So, I mean, in my experience, a lot of time that we have assumptions that we need to protect these people and use pseudonyms, but when I go to offer them options with the informed consent, a lot of people would tell us that no, and I want you to make sure that you use my real names, because this is something I'm very proud of. And I mean, I have seen patients that they know that we have an interview booked in the afternoon. They will go to the nurse and make sure that they have makeup on and they get a hair wash, and we're coming to do an interview. They feel like a superstar, right?
Yeah, it's different when you sort of know you're going to be standing up here and it's like you've washed your hair. I did wash my hair this morning. Great. So moving then specifically to a question that is targeted, I think, more at Jennifer, but others might want to step in. It's the use of the term reflexivity and sort of like trying to really understand, because when I tweeted, I actually got that wrong. I didn't put reflexivity, so apologies for that. So like, what exactly do we mean by researcher reflexivity? Like, what does that look like?
So I'm stepping outside my own sort of comfort zone here by speculating a little bit, so I'm going to say what I mean by that, and that is situating yourself within the context of what's happening. So it's a relational positioning of your own bias as a researcher and your interactions with the patient partner and understanding what this power dynamic is, and so reflecting on that and appreciating that despite the intentions and the earnestness of equity and equality and all of these things, the space that this is happening in is the healthcare space, it is the institutional space, it is the researcher's office. They're not coming into the patient partner's house to sit at their table to drink their tea, right? So this is all happening within a context and a space that sets up a kind of dynamic that should be queried and reflected on. And I think the researcher is in the position as the one who has the inherent power and the inherent is creating the space for this encounter to happen. It's incumbent upon them to reflect on that and surface it and acknowledge it, and in my world it would be actually documented and somehow accounted for and revealed and transparent and reflected on also by the patient partner. Not that they have to agree on what's happening, but I think this needs to be, I've lost the word, but more transparent.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Lillian, do you want to?
I would like to add to do reflexivity, and you can do it individually. And as a researcher, you think about your practice and your some of the moral principles that that guy, what is good to do and how you relate to another person. But I think it's limited in a way that if you do it on your own. And I know that when I do research with Jim, that we'll go to a coffee house and we'll sit down and have coffee together and we'll talk together about I was thinking about that and what do you think about that, and when we do research in the team, that we do team reflection as well. So I often find there's things that will surprise me that what I think about, it's not really what it is about. And also sometimes it surprise patients and family partners or physicians. He might have his own assumptions and thinking about how the things that he had done or he think about and what it means to the other person. Yeah. So I think it's also very important to do team reflection or do reflection with others. Yeah.
And I think we do that too little. I think that's a really good steer. And I think like it speaks to, we should be doing that more generally in our lives, in other aspects of our lives. So, well, maybe I'm just speaking for myself. But so two like very different questions. I've got to choose one of them. So I'm going to choose the one as a final one that deals with this disciplinary boundaries and assumptions that we make about the contribution and role that people are coming to make or to play, and the ethical challenge that exists in, I guess, building effective teams where you need that clarity of role and clarity of what is being brought to play. So is that enough? Do you need me to say more? Does that give you something to grasp onto? Apologies for the person who wrote that question that I butchered, but could you try?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you,
I
Holly.
have tons to say about that, actually. This is an ethics issue that I tend to be a confident person. I don't have a problem expressing my views, and I'm not soft, and if somebody were to reject what I'm saying, it doesn't bother me, but that's just my personality. And I took it for granted that when we started a lot of the processes up that we have now at Provincial Service authority around multidisciplinary teams that, and I'm also used to sitting on research ethics boards, which are, intense. And and your views get interrogated, let me tell you, if you're an ethicist, or if you're anybody on the board. So I'm kind of used to that, and I've been, that's my profession, that's how I've been trained. But I didn't take for granted how difficult it would be for some folks that I viewed as experts. I spend a lot of time worrying about, what are the community members going to say, or how are they going to feel, and we make sure that they feel honored on the board. But there's certain groups, like privacy is a good example, that has been very siloed, and then asking them to participate in a multidisciplinary group where you're getting interrogated by one of the top physicians at PHSA is unpleasant. It's hard, and there are ethics issues around that because you have to, and I didn't do a good enough job thinking about that when we first started up those kind of governance committees, but we were just talking about today about having a better intake process and preparing people and say, this may not be right for you, and that's okay. It could be somebody else from your team, but you have to be able to, put your ideas out there. You have to be comfortable being interrogated and also interrogating other people. You have to challenge, these big fancy researchers, these smarty pants. So you have to be able to do that to get your ideas out there. So it's not for everybody, and that's just one model of governance, and it's not appropriate for all different types of research. So that's an ethics issue that arose for us just recently, actually.
Great, thank you very much.
I'll just add one. I'll just add one dimension. Okay, it's broadcasting, and that is in my sphere, I guess, of peers, of particularly parents and caregivers who participate in engagement activities. There's often a pre-existing relationship with a researcher with whom somebody partners. So, now we're getting a little bit more programmatized where there's a kind of recruitment or there's a partnering up of patients and skill sets, and, it's a little bit more professionally organized in that way. But I also see just as frequently a personal relationship migrating to this patient partner and researcher or it's not even a personal relationship, it's a patient physician relationship. And this sort of goes back to, I think, one of the previous questions about the potential for harm and these kinds of shifting of roles. And it's not just a shifting of role, but it's a holding of multiple roles. And so you're still possibly taking your child to see that same researcher or clinician who is also a researcher, and now you're partnering on something, now you're co-authoring something. And what happens, so where the ethical piece comes into my mind, is what happens when that relationship gets compromised or suffers in some way, or there's a fracture or a disagreement. Who is holding more at stake here, right? And what we talk about vulnerability, and I think the patient partner is more vulnerable in that situation to feeling that their potential care will be compromised, their relationship with the institution will be compromised. They can't just fade away into the woodwork. What's going to happen then? So I think there's very little support for that. Where I don't want to use you guys, well, I'm going to use you guys as an example, but let's say something fell apart here in the relationship. Jim, where would you go with a complaint or with a need for redress in some way, or what would happen then, right? So I don't know that I don't know of any stories where there's a successful remediation process or there's a support process, particularly for the patient partner, in this kind of complex multiple role situation.
Thanks. Do you want to add anything, Liz?
Yeah, so, that speaks to it's ongoing negotiations, and it's important to have ongoing relationship, and before it gets worse, to be open to have dialogue. I think that's very important. And there's always, I will go back always to the power relations, and when you have a team of people coming from different disciplines, for example, when you have I think the way that we think comes from the training and the education, and all brought up, and for, let's say, the social robot research, when we have physicians in the team, often the mindset or the thinking will be thinking about, the randomized control trials, the way that we develop intervention protocol. Those are higher rank type of knowledge compared to other questions that we would like to ask. But when we have family partners, and when we have patient partners, and we look at some of the evidence, to look at, all those intervention protocols, it's like the music research that, if we, prescribe patients music, 30 minutes a week, like 30 minutes a day, twice a week we talked about, and then we compare pre and post, and sometimes, and then we look at maybe like outcomes of cognitions and behavior change, we talked about that. Then if you see no significance, does that mean that, music is not helpful? And no, we know no, and we actually will argue, like in terms of, how we use public funding to do this type of research. It's kind of silly to ask the questions to test the effectiveness of music for people, because we know it helps. But I think when you have like patient and family partners in a team, it makes us to think about like how we should be asking those questions. How we should be providing music, and all those questions that come up from patient and families, it challenges us to innovate the new ways of doing things. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. And just on that sort of like, we all bring something of our background and experience and training to the table. I'm always bringing economics to the table, sorry, but I can't help that. So I'm conscious now that the opportunity cost of carrying on is cheese and wine. So we're going to close. So apologies for those people who had questions that we didn't get to. We will get to them in the tweet chat, which is happening on Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? It's November the 26th. I think it's a Tuesday at midday Pacific time. Please join us for that. But please join me now in saying a very big thank you to our closing panel.